Tonight I can see you all flooding in. We've already got over 500 participants and I can see that that number's going up. It's great to see you all getting involved with the chat as well. And so our topic tonight is, what is a green recovery and what shape must it take? I think that we're all clear that we need to be ensuring that we tackle inequality in our communities while looking towards a green future. I'm Amelia Womack, I'm Deputy Leader of the Green Party and will be hosting this event. And it's fantastic to have Sarah Arnold here from the New Economics Foundation, NEF, to discuss this really vitally important topic. Now, Sarah has done some incredible work of just looking into a broad range of reasons why our economy fails us, why it creates an unequal society, and has been analysing this through the lens of coronavirus. So Sarah has been doing some incredible work in this area, and I feel like it's really inspirational. I think we can all be quite inspired by this topic. I think we can all see why we need this big vision about what the future looks like as our systems have been dismantled as a result of the pandemic and shown a fundamental flaw in our social security. I know that I've been inspired about green recovery from back in 2010 when Caroline Lucas first talked about a Green New Deal with people like Anne Pettifor and Andrew Sims. And I think this is a clear point where we know that we can't go back to business as usual. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. And just to begin with, what has inspired you to begin this work in the first place?
Well, hi, thanks for having me. So maybe, I don't know how inspiring this is as kind of a reason for why I got started in this area, but it was from reading IPCC reports, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the reports they put out. And after that, and reading about kind of the urgency of climate change and seeing the disconnect between that and kind of what governments and society were doing to take action, I felt like I needed to do something. So I volunteered with an organisation which was aiming to mobilise and empower young people to take action for global climate justice. And through that, I was connected to young people across the world. And I came to realise that for me, it was kind of an intellectual thing and it was something that I kind of believed in. But for many of the young people that I was talking to, it had a real sense of urgency. So I got connected to an equivalent organisation in the Maldives, and they were talking about how their homes will be underwater by 2030, and it really drove home to me the urgency, and also how different people were really being impacted in different ways by this stuff. And I think I started to read more and more and realise increasingly the way that people with different life experiences and inequalities people experience are due in large part due to kind of the structures of our society and our economy. I guess due to my own personal life experiences, I was particularly struck by health inequalities and how your life expectancy differs significally based on all sorts of socioeconomic circumstances, particularly the rise of deaths of despair, based on like early deaths from suicides, from drugs and alcohol, particularly linked to poverty, social isolation and mental health problems. And so that's why I kind of felt like I needed to get involved in kind of working on some of kind of the structural issues underlying why people experience different outcomes in our economy.
Amazing. And I think some of those inequalities are so stark in everyday life. And I think especially at the moment we've seen those impacts seen how entrenched many of those impacts have been. And can you tell us a little bit more about NEF as well and the mission there?
Okay, so NEF is an organisation that kind of tries to strike a balance between two things. Firstly, there's kind of the big picture. When we kind of look at these systemic issues, there's this really big picture that all these things are interlocking and there's loads of stuff going on. And so there's a danger of not thinking big picture enough and reinforcing the status quo. But there's also, when you focus on the really big picture, there's a danger of this kind of abstract idealism and not anchoring in the here and now. And actually, how do we make the change that we want to see that will kind of change these big structures? And NEF sees its role as kind of a balance between the two, working with campaigning organisations, but also kind of more traditional think tanks and other forms of civil society to take big picture ideas and do the research and generate kind of the numbers and the work to kind of think about how to make the big picture happen. And in terms of content, kind of we work across, I guess, 3 main areas. Firstly, climate change and the climate imperative. So what are the key radical goals we need to decarbonize and get ourselves towards a Green New Deal? Secondly, how to significantly reduce inequality between people and between places, so whether that's regional inequality, income inequality, health inequality, wealth inequality, all types of inequalities. And finally, doing both these things while increasing the role of democracy, whether that's devolving power more locally or increasing participation for everybody. And I don't think we always get everything perfect, and things are obviously changing massively in this current context, but that's, I guess, a broad overview of what we're doing, what we're trying to do. I think
and certainly key principles that we have as Greens and an ethos that we share in many of those points there. And I think what's really important in regards to this meeting is how does that contribute to green recovery and a regenerative green economy?
Sure, so these are the kinds of things that NEF has been arguing for, I think, for quite a long time, actually. In around 2008, NEF was part of a group of organisations calling for kind of a need for a green transformation, because we need fundamental transformation of the economy along these lines. And I think that's been true for a long time, but it's becoming increasingly important as we kind of approach the tipping point of needing to take action on climate change, but also as kind of other inequalities are being exposed, for example, through this pandemic.
And obviously the ecological emergency as well. I feel like quite often we talk about the climate emergency first and foremost, but I think your work also really incorporates, whether that's looking at kind of coastal communities, green aspects when it comes to ecological points, as well as climate change as well. So it really creates a big vision and a big picture and analysis of what our economy can look like. And I must admit, the work you've done has certainly informed lots of the points that I've researched. And it's really, if no one's been to the NEF website, it's definitely worth checking out for that analysis. So I think that we're looking at what our society will look like. We can talk about post-COVID, but it's looking like we're probably going to be living with this for quite some time. And I feel like the government has no choice but to build back something better than before, that people don't want to return to business as usual, because what the hell was normal about what was being called normal before. So in terms of green recovery, we're looking at one that's meaning to address inequality, environmental, climate, social justice, and we can't have it watered down by any other conflicting policies. It's a vast subject, but we're going to try and cover as many threads of that as possible here today. So just beginning about how that really does enhance equality by making sure that all of these aspects are intertwined. So back in May 2010, a Smith School report on green recovery said that any recovery package, including climate-friendly recovery, is unlikely to be implemented unless it also addresses existing social and political concerns, poverty, inequality, and social inclusion. Given that, what elements need to be included into the green recovery package to make sure that we are addressing those issues? I mean, we can talk about education, training, job opportunities. We will need to know how we can train more people to retrofit more homes and boilers, and looking at our energy grid, making sure that we're engaging in jobs that aren't necessarily just about climate reductions alone and into areas like caring. So how do you ensure that those training and job opportunities are available and accessible to everyone?
Sure. Well, I think part of the reason why this recovery is currently at the forefront of people's minds is that the economy has clearly taken an unprecedented dive And a particular concern is the loss of jobs. And I'm sure many people on this call are very aware of this, but I think it's worth reiterating kind of the scale of what we're talking about here. There have been over 2.8 million new claims for out of work benefits since the start of lockdown, which represents the most dramatic worsening of the labour market for more than 100 years. And while not all of these people will be out of work, some of these will just be kind of claiming this in terms of income support. And some of this is due to the lockdown, which might, and so some of these people will return to work potentially as the lockdown is lifted. It's also worth pointing out that, it's also worth pointing out that currently over 9 million workers are on the furlough scheme. And so as that is unwound, we're likely to see huge job losses. And predicting what's to come is hard, but we really are expecting huge amounts of job losses. And so one of the key things that is needed, I think, as you referred to, Amelia, is large-scale government investment to create jobs. And that will need to be in green infrastructure, but also other infrastructure vital for the sustainable future we need, social infrastructure like care. But besides kind of all these massive amounts of job losses, what the pandemic has also done is exposed and exacerbated many of the kind of existing underlying inequalities in our society between people and between places, both in terms of the health impacts and the economic impacts. And while many of these have been quite widely reported, it's worth kind of just revisiting some of these, because different places have been much more affected than others. Places with lower than average incomes have been significantly more affected in the north, for example. Those on lower incomes are much more affected than those on higher incomes. Not so much in terms of income losses, which have been proportionately quite evenly distributed across the board, but in terms of consumption, where people on higher incomes are generally able to save quite a significant amount of money right now because they're not able to go out and spend on some of the more traditional activities. But those on the lowest incomes are essentially have to spend all their money on the basics, things like food, which costs are currently skyrocketing, and therefore debt is hugely increasing among those in lower incomes. And then looking at kind of different groups of people that are being particularly affected, BME people are both more exposed to the health impacts of the virus, as reports are making very clear, but also the economic impacts as well, as it's generally workers on lower income and in insecure work contracts that have been most affected, who are disproportionately BME people. Young people have also been significantly affected. They're more likely to have lost their jobs rather than being furloughed. And they also are more likely to work in industries that are in lockdown and they've simply just been let go rather than furloughed. And also women are much more likely to have taken cuts to their work, particularly in regards to having to take on additional caring responsibilities, and BME women in particular have been affected. So given all this, the recovery absolutely needs to kind of address these issues. And there has been some discussion about how job creation can be particularly targeted at certain groups of people. There's been some discussion about how jobs and training opportunities can be particularly targeted at young people. But I think we also need to think about addressing some of the more structural issues in the long term. And there's a couple of different ways we can do that. Firstly, one really important thing to do is to increase security of income for everybody. Through both reform of kind of our social security system, reform of universal credit, but also proposing a much more generous income level of income security for everybody. So at NEF, we're proposing something like we're calling a minimum income guarantee, which would essentially be kind of an income floor for everybody, which will not allow anyone's income to fall below that level. And it would be a much more generous level than currently is available under universal credit, which is a meager £90 a week, which is not nearly enough to kind of afford the basics. Research by JRF and by the Centre of Social Research has found that generally people need about at least £220 a week to just be able to afford the basics. So £90 is way too low. So we need a much higher level of income security for everybody. And that's not just for citizens, that should be for everybody, even regardless of migration status, even those with no recourse for public funds. Secondly, we also need a much higher level of investment in our public services, together with that social security reform. And together they would act as kind of a social safety net or a collective insurance system against risk. But also by investing in things like a universal care service, childcare, social care, it would ensure that the burden of caring, which currently disproportionately falls on women, and particularly BME women, will be more fairly distributed. And finally, in terms of reducing inequality, we'll need to overhaul our tax system to pay for these things and to redistribute incomes much more fairly. And not just income, but also wealth. We have a very unfair tax system right now, and it needs significant change. Sorry, I've talked quite a lot there.
No, that was amazing. And I think it's such a big topic while talking about inequality, and which has been plaguing our economy for such a long time. I feel like plague isn't a good term to use in the current context, but I mean, it's been one of the underlying issues that's gone unaddressed for far too long. And I think that making sure that our conversations are always addressing these inequalities is so vitally important at any time, but especially now when we see so many people fundamentally failed by a kind of politics and policies that was never built and work for them. But I think we're digging deeper onto this issue. Let's have a quick look at business and what a green recovery might look like for business. So will the government need a stimulus package for the business world? What form should that take? And what would stimulus in private investment look like in this? And how do we do things like promote clean tech and over fossil fuels and make sure that we end our fossil fuel dependency?
Sure. So I guess the key objectives of any recovery package should be to kind of stabilize expectations and restore confidence, and channel surplus saving into productive investment. But without kind of a market shaping role, without the government kind of really clearly directing that and reshaping the market, we'll end up with very much business as usual investment, which we know implies kind of temperature increases over 3 degrees centigrade, and it doesn't help at all with kind of the decarbonisation and the change to our economy that we need. So what we really need from the government is quite significant intervention and market shaping behaviour. And the kinds of things I mean by that are things like government grants in industrial strategy funds, increasing that to directly invest in green research and development. And setting up something like a green investment bank, which basically through its terms of reference, it has to invest in green stuff. Because right now, part of the problem with kind of standard investment banks is when they're choosing where to invest money, is that they can't choose to invest in kind of green stuff unless they can demonstrate that the green stuff is creates the highest economic return of all other investments, which isn't necessarily always going to be the case in our current economic system. But a green investment bank, through its terms of reference, would specifically be focused on finding investment opportunities that both create returns and are green, but they don't necessarily have to create the highest returns of all possible investments. And that will help steer things by uncovering profitable opportunities in green activities. And it will also kind of stimulate some of the kind of the initial barriers, the initial barriers to some of the green investment in the first place. And thirdly, another way that the government can kind of signal this change in direction is to raise tax on polluting activity, which would disincentivize kind of the investment in those kinds of things and incentivize, therefore, investment in less polluting activities.
I always think it's incredible the choices that are made about our futures, essentially as a result of investment that is working to a broken process, as you've described. I just want to thank everyone who's joined us so far. We've got well over 600 people involved. We will be going to some questions at the end if we have time. So the Green Party team will be collecting those and compiling some of the ones that we'll be asking. But I can see that you're involved in the chats, and it's great. We've got these different interactions happening. So thank you everyone who's been getting involved in that. We're just looking at some of the points you raised in your introduction. as Greens, we really believe in the power of localism. And so what we've been talking about on the national level, but what does a green recovery look like on a local level? Is further devolution on a regional level, as well as for places like our Welsh Parliament and our Scottish Parliament needed, as well as the Northern Ireland Assembly? And where can local government start at tackling these big issues?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. So this is, remind me if I need to come back to any of those.
Of course.
So this is absolutely not just about national policy. This needs to happen at every single level of government. So that means regional councils, city councils, devolved administrations, local economic partnerships, all can create their own kind of local industrial strategies, all can, or local Green New Deals. And I am aware that certain levels and certain areas of government have indeed done that. Some of my colleagues, for example, are working directly with Croydon on a climate commission. And I know that the Welsh government, through kind of the Future Generations Commissioner, is also looking at ways of doing this. And local government, even kind of at a very local level, local governments do have many existing powers available to them currently to support local Green New Deals or local action. One really kind of overlooked thing sometimes is convening power. So local governments have quite strong convening power. They can bring different areas and organisations together, where other organisations might not have that power. Other examples are kind of supporting shared apprenticeships between different businesses. Local councils have control over buildings that they own and their assets, so they can reduce rates and rents and business rates for certain socially valuable businesses, that kind of thing. All sorts of different combined authorities have various different powers. They have control over transport, so they can look into doing things differently there. There's a huge range of different ways that different levels of government and authorities can do things. But it's not easy, I have to say. I mean, I guess that might have sounded a bit flippant. It's not easy at all. And in particular, it's a very challenging funding environment for many councils at the moment. I would say over the last 10 years, austerity has essentially been devolved onto councils over the last decade, where many councils at kind of a local authority level in particular, councils have seen cuts of approximately half of their grants. And while that has been replaced by increased business rates retention, that's been particularly kind of held by certain councils, particularly in London, that's been beneficial for, and it's been devastating for other councils. And the current crisis is only exacerbating things, with more and more councils calling for increased funding, or there are concerns that they'll go into administration, basically. So I absolutely think that there are some things councils can currently do and some things government can currently do at a local level, but there absolutely needs to be more funding to allow this to happen. And it's not just about kind of more fiscal devolution or the government just saying local governments can just retain more locally. There needs to be a fundamental reform of how local governments are actually funded to allow that to happen. Because the conversation right now seems very much, at least at a local authority level, concerned with the kind of the distribution of income between local authorities. And there's all sorts of reviews at the moment about business rates reform and about the fair funding review and all this, but there's actually not there's not anyone looking, there's not kind of an official look into whether that level of funding is sufficient, and council's making it clear that it is absolutely not sufficient. And so I think local government should continue loudly and collectively calling for more funding or devolution of new taxes that can be then fairly distributed. Some work that we've been doing, or that I've looked into, is the need for a potential land value tax. And where a land value tax has potential is that, unlike some other taxes, it's not taxing productive investment into kind of productive activity that businesses need. Land gets its value broadly from its location and from the collective investments and efforts of society over decades and decades. And so it makes sense to tax that a lot more at a much higher rate, to tax these kinds of rentier profits that landlords essentially get just from holding this land, as a way of funding local government.
Amazing. I think I'm seeing some questions popping up in the chat, as well as lots of comments about how inspiring you are and how great this is. I think we're all learning a lot, and I think it's such a powerful discussion. So thank you so far, Sarah. And there are some points that have been popping up about some of these policies, and many of these are aligned with what we're fighting for in the Green Party. Things like a land value tax have been in our manifesto for decades. We differ slightly as Greens. We support a universal basic income, making sure it's a minimum payment to people across the country, rather than the specific point that Sarah made. And things like, we also support, I noticed someone asking about Ecocide, and we do campaign to end Ecocide. It's been part of our manifesto. And that intertwines with something that Sarah talked about with the Future Generations Act in the Welsh Assembly, which fundamentally means we have to analyse policy, not just how it impacts our generation, but how it impacts generations to come. And this is something we proudly put in our manifesto as well. We've always, as Greens, look at what the kind of world we want to create is, and have a manifesto as a stepping stones to getting there. And these big ideas and these big changes are how we look to transform our economy. So great to see that we've got so much in common in all of those points. Just digging a little bit deeper into well-being. And I know from speaking to you, you can have that difference between the well-being of a country and the well-being in general, but also the well-being of the individual. But how do we make sure that we make the economy work for people? Even in the chat, I see it popping up about how GDP is a terrible way of actually measuring what's important to people and people's lives, whether that's addressing things like we've touched on, like inequality, or working to tackle climate change. So how do these policies impact things like our well-being beyond things like GDP? How does it look into things like a work-life balance? And how could this green recovery, along with other measures, contribute to our communities and help build genuine resilience within our communities themselves?
Sure. Well, I guess firstly, to say at kind of a national level maybe, and at a local level, what we choose to prioritise and measure matters. And so there's a lot of interest in wellbeing economy approaches right now. In New Zealand, in Scotland, in Wales, in Iceland, and in other places, there's a big movement towards kind of, and governments are actually doing this, developing democratically agreed frameworks around national priorities, that they're generally being called kind of wellbeing frameworks. And they're slightly different in each country, but most generally they're all around things like increasing sustainability, creating opportunities for all to participate in society, whether that's through kind of standard employed work or through other opportunities, increasing the quality of jobs, ensuring that they're paid at a sufficient level, and that people have flexibility in how they work, increasing individual health and well-being, and reducing inequalities between people and places. And one approach that's taking it even a step further is a wellbeing budget, which then takes these priorities and explicitly assigns government spending and budget towards these priorities. And that can be at a national level or also at a local level. So this can be done much more locally. And so I think it's really important that we in England and in the UK start thinking and pushing for something like that. So that we start prioritising the things that do actually matter, much more beyond GDP. And then in terms of specifically, I think, because you asked about a work-life balance, I think, again, this is something that the pandemic has exposed huge interest in, partly because we're having to lots of people are having to fundamentally change the way that they work as a result of this current crisis. And so I think there's a huge interest at the moment in a 4-day week, or at least reducing kind of working time. I think the argument is becoming much more clear for this. One way to get there, for example, would be national, as kind of our economy picks up again and we become more productive, those kind of national productivity gains could be shared across the economy through increasing creation of bank holidays. So each time say the economy increases its productivity by 1%, instead of just saying, hooray, our GDP is increasing, sharing those gains by giving everybody more bank holidays. But I would also say that individual workplaces and individual workers should look into this as well, and should call on their workplaces to do so if that's appropriate for them through unions. Other things I guess people are starting to realise is more important is a kind of, more generally a work-life balance through kind of increasingly working at home, and basically just being much more flexible in the way that we work, and recognising different ways that we all contribute to the economy as well, that it's not just about kind of the standard paid work, the importance of the caring economy as well, and other ways that people contribute.
Amazing. We're a proud supporter of the 4-day week, and I think it shows one of those other inequalities that I see growing. People who are on extreme salaries are able to take this as an organic process, reducing their working hours and increasing their work-life balance. I look at the university I used to go to at Imperial College. The Vice-Chancellor there used to earn £350,000 a year to work a 3-day week. And when people say this won't happen organically, a 4-day working week, it is happening organically for the richest in society. Again, creating yet another inequality when it comes to issues in terms of where the wealth is, but also issues in terms of who then has genuine well-being and work-life balance as a result. We actually have a few questions coming in. I'm just going to try and build one of them in now, because there are all these different campaigns that certainly we've been working on, and obviously at NEF you'll be supporting. And Claire McLevner wants to just know that there's so many of these campaigns working to address these issues. Do you have any ideas about how we can improve joint working together in terms of how we build back better the Green New Deal and these aspects, and make sure that we are working in collaboration with each other?
Absolutely. I think you're right that, I mean, loads of different organisations are calling for all sorts of different things, and frankly, loads of people are calling for all sorts of different things under the Build Back Better message. That's something that I think most people can get behind, this idea that we need to build back better. Where things maybe get a little bit more complicated is that it turns out when you dig into the detail, people mean quite different things by building back better. And often people can get lost in some of the kind of well, I think there's two issues. Firstly, some people can get lost in kind of the overarching structure of what we're trying to build back better, and really kind of get worried about it should be one specific thing or another specific thing. So I think we need to, as a group of, as kind of collective organisations who are trying to work in this space, need to accept that there's lots of different ways that we can build back better, and make space for each other's ideas, and that's fine that there's a whole raft of ideas. But also it's worth emphasising that while we do have a lot of differences, there's also quite a lot of similarities, and it's also important to recognise where, even if you have kind of specific policy details that are a little bit different, that many of these things are trying to all move in the same direction. So where Amelia made the point that the Green Party would call for kind of a universal basic income, so that everybody gets paid something into their bank account, or however that would work. And we're calling for something such as a minimum income floor with a means tested element on top. They're both kind of very similar ideas that are trying to get at fundamentally this issue that everybody should have a secure income, and nobody should feel that they don't have enough to live on. And so it's about identifying, I think, and maybe this is where a well-being framework or an outcomes framework is really helpful. It's about identifying where we actually want to get to, and then start working out how the details are to get there. But generally, I think it's just really important to have as many conversations as possible, and to support each other where possible as well.
Brilliant, I completely agree. Getting back to our questions, and we're about to hit the big one of what is the economy? We've talked about social justice, we've talked about business, societal and individual well-being. How should we best measure the success of our economic models? Maybe we could go a little bit into what is GDP, what are its limitations, and how do we best distribute the wealth and its impact on our well-being?
Okay, wow. So I think let's start with kind of what is the economy, or what I would say what is the economy and what is GDP has become quite synonymous in people's heads, and I think this is a bit of a mistake. But GDP is essentially just a measure of some economic activity in society. Very specifically, the goods that we buy and sell in marketplaces, so that get recorded. And Bobby Kennedy, a presidential candidate in the 1960s, gave a very famous speech that many people may have heard, but I think it's worth kind of thinking about, and I think about it every time I think about the problems with GDP. He says that GDP measures all sorts of things in society except that which is important for us to measure. So it includes all sorts of things that aren't important, like the sales of weapons, and things like that, but it misses out kind of the health of our children, it misses out how educated we are, it misses out how we actually feel. So GDP is not a very good measure of actually what we care about in society. And I think broadly, if we think about the economy in its broadest sense, the economy is one way of looking at how we choose to organize ourselves in society through kind of exchanges of resources, and that's just one measure of society. But it is I would say it is a very important measure of society, because it is how we interact in many different ways. But I think we just need to think about it in its very broadest sense. So it's not just about GDP. It's about kind of the unpaid activities people take. It's about kind of how we care for each other. It's about kind of like lending things to our friends. It should be a much more broad way of looking at how we interact with each other in society.
Brilliant. And I think, I mean, it's been a measure for such a short amount of time. It's incredible that it has become so synonymous with the economy, as you said. And I think that when we're thinking differently about how our economy works, it'd be great to talk a little bit about what the circular economy is and how that could potentially change how things operate.
Sure. So I think there's not one exact definition of the circular economy. I guess there's no one exact definition of most of these things. But broadly, the circular economy is kind of aims at getting at a different conception of consumption and production. So it's not about this kind of make, use, dispose linear approach that we currently have, much more about trying to reduce consumption, reuse and recycle resources, change the way that we produce things to minimize waste and pollution. And it's not just, it doesn't just have to happen on kind of like the production of kind of the standard goods that you might think of, like manufacturing. It can happen at a very systemic level, thinking about everything that we produce and use in our economy and trying to reduce the impacts of that.
Brilliant. I just want to very quickly bring in the quote from Elinor Ostrom, who first highlighted, well, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on debunking the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So her evidence showed that it counterclaims the idea that humans are inherently selfish. It turns out that in terms of the economy, we humans can share and live with the resources available. And her message and work was that of groups that are capable of avoiding a tragedy of the commons in society without requiring top-down regulation. So it's interesting that she won the Nobel Prize in 2009, just after the financial crisis that happened. And I think until now, we're still analysing some of those aspects. And I think even in the papers just this week, talking about how people have reacted to coronavirus, and how we've been thinking about ourselves as humanity, as our communities, as neighbours and friends, has been incredibly different to how we've been acting before. So how do we make sure that, based on these aspects and potentially based on some of these ideas that have been built out of coronavirus, that we make sure that we do create systems that are more equitable for everybody?
Well, I think part of the reason why we've got ourselves in this state is because many people have allowed themselves to believe that the way things currently are the way things kind of always have been and the way things always will be, because there's something about human nature maybe that is inherently selfish, or just everybody is out for themselves. But I think there's all sorts of examples where this is not necessarily the case. I've always been struck by some really interesting research that showed that where a lot of this stuff came from, in terms of us thinking that humans are really selfish, is research carried out on economics students at university. And it turns out if you teach people that everybody is selfish, and then you ask them if everybody is selfish, they're going to tell you that everyone is selfish. And it's kind of this self-perpetuating model. But there are moments of change where we can actually see that this is not necessarily true. I think this is one of them. The last financial crash was potentially one of them, but we kind of unfortunately did not take as much advantage of that as we could have done. Right now, people are coming together. People are in many ways, and there are some examples of some people not, but on the whole, people are trying to follow the rules, trying to make things better. And so what I think we need to do is, when there are ideas that show that we can do things differently, we take them and we need to call for them. We need to continue to drive for that, and not accept that this is the status quo is how it's always been and how it always will be, and call for change.
Brilliant. And I think what I'm seeing in a lot of these questions, people are looking for change, are really thirsty for that change to happen. There's a question from Edward that is, how is the economy going to be transformed, and what levers do you suggest the government applies to steer the market towards a sustainable, inclusive economy? How should it, again, a lot of questions, Sarah, but I'll just run through them, and it'd be great just to get your thoughts in general. How should it set out the environment and context within which a green economy will thrive?
Well, I mean, there's two things. Firstly, is that there does need to be kind of some fundamental measures put in place right now to support people who have fallen through the gaps of current government support. Things like a minimum income guarantee or significant reform of social security, just to support people right now as they're going through this crisis. But in the more long term, I think we just need to reorientate our priorities for the economy. And so I talked a little bit about this before, but I think one thing that would be really helpful would be a wellbeing framework, or a framework that explicitly sets out the priorities of government. And it shouldn't just be created by MPs alone. It should be a really democratic and truly participatory process that brings in different groups and balances different views, but so that we can have a collectively agreed framework of where we actually want to get to. And that should include things like climate, like sustainability, alongside all other priorities. And then we'll be able to actually assign budgets and come up with and assign our policies against these priorities. And it means that we'll be able to hold government to account against these things, because right now nearly everything is done in service of GDP, or to some, pretty much everything is done in service of GDP. And so having an explicit aim of where we actually want to get to, I think is an important starting point. And then I think I've kind of set out potentially lots of different ideas of how we could potentially get there. But I do think a really important thing is to ensure that everybody has security of income and everybody has the basics to live, which would eliminate some of the really, really high issues with kind of poverty that are particularly problematic.
And just to build on that and to make the question even bigger, we've had over 100 questions actually around how can NEF and the Green Party implement these ideas, and recognising the fact that we've got a huge Tory majority at the moment, how do we influence the Tories in terms of what policies we should be supporting and working to deliver?
So I think, yes, the Tories have a majority, but they have a majority that was made up in many ways of kind of quite new constituencies, and so they do need to think about slightly new ways of working, and they're also acting in quite a different context to how they have done previously. So one thing I think that works in our favour right now is that there's consistently polling over the last couple of months that there is a huge appetite for change. People really want to do things differently. Even before this crisis, the government was talking about the need to level up different regions of the country, and that also involves doing things differently, involves shifting power away from London, involves shifting towards different measures of success, because otherwise you can't do that. So I think there's a huge appetite for change. What's really important though is to ensure that that change is not captured in the interests of just the standard interests. So I did some research the other day into who's kind of had their incomes protected over the course of this crisis. I looked across looked at male and female incomes in all different sectors of the economy. And the research found that it was men in the banking sector who had experienced no drop in income on average, and everybody else had experienced a drop in income on average. And so even when kind of the rhetoric is about ensuring that no one is left behind, things are still being captured by the usual suspects. And so I think it's really important, one thing that we need to be really careful about is to really scrutinise the rhetoric and really call for things, not just ensuring that the change that we're all calling for, because it is pretty much everybody is calling for change, but it really is benefiting everybody and that really no one is being left behind. So that involves calling out things when we see that it's not working, but also helping to come up with some of these more creative ideas, because I think the government is currently stuck in its status quo thinking, or it was, but there is opportunity for change. I think the willingness of the government to kind of go much further than I think anyone expected through the furlough scheme suggests it is potentially possible and they can be influenced. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Brilliant. We all need hope and optimism, especially at this time. And I think I also have a lot of confidence in the dedicated campaigners out there who are using their tools that we have available to make sure that we're lobbying and petitioning and writing to our MPs, speaking to the press, and making sure that we're building that vision as well through our own power and not just looking to the MPs as well. But your points there tie into a question that we had from David, which was, can you talk more about how oppression of BAME people specifically is going to be addressed by the Green Recovery?
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's just one way that BME people have been addressed. Have faced issues over the last decades and currently. And so what we really need is complete structural fundamental change of the economy that would help. And there is no one specific kind of green recovery, I should say. But again, many of the things I have been suggesting or have been talking about will specifically help some of the inequalities that are experienced by BME people. I think there is a lot more further needs to be thought about this, but some of the specific things that would help is an income guarantee that ensures income security for everybody. Again, particularly that would support BME people who are more likely to have insecure work contracts. So that would give them more support there. Much more investment in kind of public services. But I think there needs to be much more to be done in terms of thinking about what is needed on this scale, and much more because it's this kind of, because oppression has been so systemic, there needs to be a huge amount of change. And so what I suggested is kind of just the first steps.
Brilliant. And there are lots of questions about kind of in a similar vein. So there's one from Catherine that's how, when we make the transition to a Green New Deal and a green economy, how do we make sure that there aren't people or groups who are left behind, as they have been in previous transitions, which we could say was globalization, and how have these groups, e.g. people currently working in non-green industries, been considered? Do you want me to repeat that? Sorry.
I think I think the more universal approaches are, the less likely people are to fall through the gaps, most generally, because you can have a system that's kind of really targeted at individual groups, but that will always probably leave somebody behind. And so what we need to do is reorientate our thinking. So not just to try and target at those who are particularly needy, but think about a system that helps to lift everybody up, to ensure that nobody is left behind. And if that means that some people get a little bit more support than perhaps they need, and it ends up a little bit more expensive, I think that's more important than risking some people being left behind. Because I think right now that the approach is much more concerned about ensuring that no one gets a penny more than they could possibly need, rather than the alternative approach of trying to lift everybody up collectively.
Amazing, Sarah. I mean, we're getting such great feedback from this event. Everyone saying how inspiring you are, and just how you're really restoring people's energy about what we can do next. I have a bit of a quick fire round for you. And so to begin with, my first question is, to see change in the world, what one piece of advice would you give our guests tonight? Yeah, so I mean, so I guess I've tried to be quite optimistic in the way that I'm talking today, but I would say that trying to create change is really hard, right? You need to simultaneously be aware of kind of the many issues with how our economy and society works, and hold on to the anger actually and the impetus that generates to try and make that change, but at the same time not be consumed by that anger and be kind of paralyzed into kind of inaction by kind of just the scale of it all. So this is a bit of a cliche, but I guess my main advice would be kind to yourself, and be kind to others, because it's really hard to remember when thinking about all this. So yeah, just be kind. I love it. I actually, you talked about anger. I always got frustrated with that slogan that became so popular, the keep calm and carry on one, whereas I felt it more should be get angry and get organized, because I think that's how we're all feeling at the moment, and certainly when that became popular. So what would you suggest is should be people's first step into getting more active in the green economy? I mean, so that really depends on your own circumstances and what opportunities are available to you. So I just think the first step is doing whatever it is that you personally can. So whether that's going to a local meeting of your local political party, that presumably most people here would be a Green Party member, but it could also be joining your union at work. It could even be if you have none of these opportunities available to you and you don't know where to start small. Just start talking to your family, start talking to your friends, and find out what opportunities are available to you. But I guess remember to walk before you can run. So it's okay to start small. Just joining and getting involved is a good first step. You don't have to immediately run committees or even speak up in meetings. Just go along and start to get involved. Amazing. And would you have any book recommendations if people wanted any further reading on this topic? So this I mean, it's been quite a really broad topic. There's all sorts of books out here there. I think some good kind of introductory ones that talk about some of these issues. Kate Raworth, I think I saw in the comments actually a lot of people talking about that. The donut economics. Mariana Mazzucato has quite a lot has two interesting books about how
how the role of the state can really get involved in terms of shaping markets, and we need much more active government intervention. And just to give NEF a bit of a plug, NEF has, so my organisation has a couple of books currently or forthcoming on working time in the 4-day week, as well as universal basic services, so the need to invest much more in our public services, as well as I'm sure loads of people in the comments have got loads more book recommendations.
Brilliant. And I think everyone's been, as I said, really inspired and about what you've been talking about, and felt really privileged by having a chance to hear your thoughts on this incredibly interesting and diverse topic. Is there a way that they can follow you on social media, or would that be the NEF accounts?
So yeah, I mean, the NEF has an account, it's at NEF on Twitter, and my personal account is I made this when I was a bit younger, I probably should change it, but it's at Sarah Sani, which I've typed in the box if anyone wants to follow me on Twitter.
Amazing, thanks Sarah. I really appreciate everything tonight. It's been so interesting, and such a privilege to have you here to speak to all our guests, members, supporters, and thank you for everyone who's got involved. I've seen you getting involved with the chat and asking questions. Sorry we've not been able to take all of those questions, but it looks like it's been an incredible discussion that's been happening on the chat as well. As we said before, we hold these events for free to make sure that we have accessibility, but we as Greens do need your help in ensuring that we have a green recovery. So if you can donate to the party, we've just posted a link for you to follow and to donate if you're able to. Also, if you're able to tweet about this event, then that would be fantastic too. But there is an event just happening in a couple of minutes with Greens of Colour. I believe it's now sold out, which hopefully they'll be broadcasting at a later date. But if you are signed up to that, please make sure you get over to that now. But I'll just end by saying I think I've got a real energy about what we can do in the future. There's a huge point in time right now where we can make some fundamental changes. These big questions about the economy and things that don't always feel like they relate to people's day-to-day lives are things that people experience the inequality of, the harm of, and fundamentally need to change. It will take each and every one of us speaking out and taking all of those actions that Sarah outlined to make sure we do that. And I'm so proud to be working alongside so many of you to achieve it, as well as organisations like NEF and Sarah as well. So thanks so much for your time tonight, Sarah. It's been such a privilege, and yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks for having me.